Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Through the prayers of our holy fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus. Jesus Christ is King. This is Timothy Flanders with the Meaning of Catholic. I am joined today by Michael Joseph. Michael, how you doing, brother?
Great, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. I was having a little lag in the video, so if you can chat, people, if y'all can let me know if there's any technical difficulties coming through in the broadcast. But today's topic is Christ against the Occult, Part 1, Introduction. So we're joined today by Michael. Michael is, in fact, he is the one who did the audiobook for the publication Introduction to the Holy Bible for Traditional Catholics. You can buy the audiobook below. It is linked on the Our Lady of Victory Press website on meaningofcatholic.com. So you can buy the audiobook that supports Michael. And Michael is here talking about the occult and occultism. And we're going to talk about why that's so important. And want to thank everybody for our subscribers, our patrons. Please check out the website and subscribe below. We're also going to be putting and posting up sources for a lot of the material that we're going to be sharing because it's a rather controversial subject. So, Michael, first of all, can you tell us about yourself and why are we discussing this topic?
I'll try to keep it contained here, but basically I grew up Catholic, but kind of in a watered down Novus Ordo church, I guess I'd call it. And I don't mean that in any sort of degrading sense, just kind of, what it was. Didn't really know a whole lot about Catholicism and never heard the word Protestant. And, you're just kind of going through the motions, I guess. And, there's a lot of difficult things with that where you, see a bunch of divorce happening and doesn't seem to be a problem. So it was really just kind of, the modern world creeping in. And so that affected my family personally. There were some trials and tribulations, younger, witnessing some things going on that were very difficult in conjunction with what you're kind of being taught. But, other than that, I could be thankful for a lot of things. And so, I became a teenager, kind of had a lot of issues. My mother died when I was young and, I was very depressed and sort of, not really understanding a whole lot about where I was going or whatever. And so kind of got away. It ironically got confirmed, but then left the church. And that's actually the story of a lot of people, just because you're just kind of going through the motions, like I said. And now reading like the Council of Trent, what confirmation is, I was like, oh boy, this is serious. So now I'm trying to be more serious, right? And then in my 20s, I got into playing music. That was kind of my alternative. I did a short stint in college and really did not like it. And just kind of a bipolarity there where there's this like nice glow about how amazing college life is supposed to be. And then there's the seedy underbelly of it, which I was always at odds with, but at the same time, succumbed to that culture in particular ways. But, it was a strange relationship. And then so getting into music, that was kind of my way out of that, got me working on something focused. And so I was pursuing that for a long time. In my 20s, I had some kind of hardcore issues with certain things, just a lot of self-inflicting damage that ended up with some, surgery, stuff like that, and then trying to find a better way. And so then later on, as pursuing music, started really wondering about the world, my place in it, and just trying to be a better person. And just thinking about things from a more spiritual minded. I was very open-minded to lots of things, but I wasn't really, I was kind of agnostic basically. And I was not enamored with modern science at all either. So I think I can thank perhaps my baptism for that. Some certain spidey senses to reject that. But so anyway, started looking into, different things here or there, and at some point realize there's a lot of very wrong things going on in the world, and you start noticing a lot of stuff with like weird occult symbolism in music coming out of Hollywood movies. And then you start wondering why that is, and you start getting some answers, but it's more of an answer of showing you that it's there and how deep it is rather than what to do about it or giving an interpretation. So I started, kind of like listening to people what you might call the alternative media community, and that gets into a lot of different areas, but really it's kind of dominated by this kind of Protestant culture or this sort of Masonic culture, but they think they're like the good Masons or something, and they're battling the dark ones or something. So there's this whole culture with that I kind of was like absorbing. And then I realized that Freemasonry and Theosophy and that kind of stuff was so ingrained in our society in all these different ways. So I figured I should read some of these books myself and just figure out what I thought about it. And I found myself in a very strange predicament where in some weird way I was defending the positions of these occultists because they were being attacked unfairly, but not agreeing with them because I found them very arrogant. So this is what I call kind of maybe what I'd say satanic panic, where people are assuming things about what they're saying, but it's not what they're actually saying. And so you're kind of bearing false witness against them, even though you know what I mean? It's like a weird place to be. So from all that, I just started doing research, and I started realizing just how wrong so many people were and what they were saying about it all. And so I thought, well, maybe I should, try to do something about that. And in my travels, to wrap up the point here, ironically, what really led me back to the Roman Catholic Church was reading about how awful the Jesuits were from a lot of Protestant sources, reading books like Alexander Hislop, The Two Babylons, and how the Roman Catholic Church is this secret pagan cult and all that kind of stuff. So I read through books like that. And, on the surface, there's some interesting things there. But on the same side of things, they would often quote Freemasons and occultists to talk about how bad the Jesuits are. So I'm like, that's kind of weird. The Freemasons are the bad guys, but you're going to use them to talk about how bad the Jesuits are. And then I found the occultists like Blavatsky using Protestant propaganda to talk about how bad the Jesuits are. So there seemed to be this dialectic, which, I could just call the WASP Masonic establishment that you can see in the secular world during the 19th century, but you also see it in the esoteric world as well. And so I kind of view political dialectics of left and right politics as kind of like the Protestant Masonic is like the spiritual version of that in a way, in my opinion. And so I think that they're connected. And so when I read through some of Blavatsky's work, she mentioned Augustin Barruel and how horribly wrong he was about the Masons, but she only used it in a couple sentences. So I said, well, I'll check this guy out. I read through the book, very long, but I was blown away, and it completely shed all of my Americanism and inclination towards the Enlightenment principles, and seeing what a farce they were. And it really it just convinced me intellectually the Roman Catholic position, where all these things coordinated just couldn't possibly be by human hands. And it's all these different groups attack the Catholic Church with a lot of the same fundamental positions, but for all entirely subjective reasons. So I found a divine hand in that. So I was kind of converted by looking at it from a different angle, I guess, the outside looking in. And so the last few years has been trying to conform to it and purging all my bad vices. So I've come a long way, but the last 2 years have really been most of that. And I also have your show to thank for that, for a lot of those things and kind of pushing through some of the tougher stuff. So that brings us to the present day, and I'll leave it at that.
Praise the Lord. That's great that it's great that you are back in the state of grace, brother, and you've come back home to the Catholic Church. So it's very interesting that you noticed sort of would you say that the Protestant is sort of the exoteric attack on the church, and the occult is sort of the esoteric attack on the church, and they're both sort of the same spirit?
I'd say that's a great way to describe it, as far as I can tell. And, you see the evolution into the dissenters and into Masonry coming out of the Protestant Reformation. And, as we go through some of the series, I think there's some excellent resources to talk about this. And I also noticed the occultists would treat people like Martin Luther or Elizabeth I in a much more favorable light than Ignatius of Loyola.
Right.
And I always thought that was weird, but now I understand. And even people like Aleister Crowley have a favorable viewpoint of Martin Luther, which is kind of strange to hear, right? And so there's this kind of like esoteric Protestantism that I think gets lost. And a lot of the things, in my opinion, get projected onto the Catholic Church erroneously. But at the same time, you do have these things within the church, during the Renaissance. There is a legitimate reaction, but unfortunately it goes too far, where the Renaissance can be like demonized on the whole, where I think it's just a balance of really like the early church dealing with the pagan philosophy, the Roman state, co-opting what's good, and then allowing that to be a tool of evangelization at the same time, accepting truth in it. But Christ is on top of that, and I think that the Masonic system is really making Christ equal to all of this pagan religion, and that is obviously the huge problem.
Right. So tell us about the United Nations. You wanted to start off with telling us why this is so relevant.
Sure. And speaking of, finding what's good in other viewpoints that are problematic for the church, I was listening to a Seventh-day Adventist who actually gave this information out. He's kind of blaming everything in the world bad on the Jesuits, but he did give me the information to look up the influence of Theosophy on the United Nations, in particular Lucis Trust. So if I was actually, let me just share this one slide and then I'll go back if that works.
I think, can you just define Theosophy as well?
Sure. And basically Madame Blavatsky's really the creator of it. There's other people involved, but she's kind of the main figurehead. And in my opinion, it's taking the Enlightenment principles and Darwinism and then mixing them with Eastern religion. Eastern religion is really kind of a key there, where she's very anti-West, and she's from Russia. And so I wonder if maybe there's like an anti-West culture built into her. And then she traveled all over the place. She was kind of an aristocrat. I'm not super familiar with her biography, but I am with her writings. And so this was all during the 19th century that this was rising. And I think that, the Catholicism that was kind of making a comeback in the 19th century is key to this. And so her and Albert Pike are part of these 19th century anti-Catholic writers from the esoteric side of things. So it's, again, a fusion of like Darwinism, Eastern religion. And I think like a lot of the Darwinism is kind of coming from Hindu conceptions and reincarnation, stuff like that, but it's just kind of secularizing it, devoid of any sort of spirituality sprinkled on top, as I say. And then there's a anti-Catholicism built into it as kind of a reaction to the Catholic Church, I think. So let me just share this real quick, and then people can see what I'm reading. Is the screen shared, Tim?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So this is taken from the Lucis Trust Foundation's website. I gave you the link so you can put in the notes. And this is the relationship of the foundation, the United Nations, and then H.P. Blavatsky's Theosophy. And they're talking about Allison Foster Bailey, who were kind of the people carrying on this tradition. And they say that, quote, "The Baileys, like the great teacher H.P. Blavatsky, for whom they had enormous respect, sought to elicit a deeper understanding of the sacrifice made by Lucifer." Not Christ making the sacrifice, of course. And Allison Foster Bailey were serious students and teachers of Theosophy, a spiritual tradition which views Lucifer as one of the solar angels whose advanced beings, who Theosophy says descended, thus the fall, from Venus to our planet aeons ago to bring the principle of mind to what was then animal man. In the theosophical perspective, the descendants of these solar angels was not a fall into sin or disgrace, but rather an act of great sacrifice, as is suggested in the name Lucifer, which means light bearer. So the fallen angels are good guys, and Lucifer is going to illuminate man, and his fall has been erroneously depicted by the Catholic Church as bad, and he's actually the one making the sacrifice. But Lucifer is really an allegory for things tied to Hinduism and Darwinian evolution, and that's where people might get caught up. So I'll move on to the next couple of points, but I don't know if you wanted to say anything on that.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Please continue.
Okay. The second point, there's an article that they link to here by this woman, Sarah, I think her name's McKenney or something. She's like one of the main spiritual heads of it. I don't know if she's still alive. This is back from like the 1980s. And she says, the secret of the fallen angels is essentially the mystery which lies behind the very plan of evolution. So there you go, evolution. For the solar angels' willingness to fall, to sacrifice themselves in order to bring the light of the principle of mind to what was then animal man, mark the coming into action of the great law of duality, by which matter, form, negative and passive, could be quickened by spirit. So the idea of this is that dialectics are going to bash each other, but this spirit of Lucifer is going to be what it evolves to, this kind of unity. And that's, part of the exegesis that more is complicated. I'll leave it at that for now. And this act of sacrifice at the dawn of humanity is a thread woven through the great scriptures and mythologies of the world. So this is allegorizing the scripture, as they will deem it, including the myth of Prometheus, who stole fire, which is an allegory for the principle of mind or reason, right? Reason alone for man. And the biblical story of the prodigal son, who left the father's home to embark upon the path of experience in the life of form and the senses and the journey to the far country. So the point is, they're allegorizing scripture. They're interpreting it how they want. They're using biblical stories like the prodigal son, but the prodigal son here seems to be Lucifer. And the fire that he stole in these myths is the intellect. And part of this intellect is to realize that basically the Catholic Church is absurd and not reasonable. And to illuminate mankind to this is to evolve him out of that old world state of being. And continuing on, I'll just finish up this part of the article. The role of the solar angels in their sacrifice on behalf of humanity is discussed at length in The Secret Doctrine by H.P. Blavatsky. In fact, in the 1887 magazine of the Theosophical Society, they took Lucifer as its name in an effort to bring clarity to what it regarded as an unfairly maligned sacrificing angel. And so they talk about Prometheus here. Now, Prometheus is a very important figure in Madame Blavatsky's work. She has a whole giant chapter on him. And of course, you can see that in the right at Rockefeller Center. He's a centerpiece, and we'll talk more about Rockefeller shortly. And number 3, a different article talks about the United Nations relationship to this Lucis Trust. And it says, quote, the Lucis Trust has consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, and world goodwill is recognized by the Department of Public Information at the United Nations as a non-governmental organization. Since their inception, Lucis Trust and World Goodwill have given their support through meditation, educational materials, and seminars by highlighting the importance of the UN's goals and activities as they represent the voice of the peoples and the nations of the world. So they are working in lockstep with the UN. They're providing meditation seminars, educational materials, and they're basically part of this, their NGO conglomerates. And then lastly, there's a little article about the positivity of the United Nations despite the chaos of World War II. And this is kind of one of their themes, harmony out of conflict. And it says, quote, a positive product of conflict, that's the title of this. As the preamble reminds us, the United Nations arose out of the ashes of global war in response to the impelling need to find a new way of dealing with conflict among nations. Thus, it is, in a peculiar sense, a positive product of conflict. When allowed to run its course, conflict evokes a strong resolve from the human soul to find a different path to peace, to search more deeply and to find the initial cause of conflict. Conflict teaches us that when wrong choices are made, they should not be repeated. The founders of the United Nations were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. They envisioned and created a world forum where human consciousness could be uplifted to a new level and where a creative capacity of the human mind and heart can resolve potential conflicts before they erupt into war. It is a pathway that calls for the sharing of responsibility for the state of the world and most importantly, the principles on which the United Nations is founded evoke from its members a greater spiritual will to serve the needs of all humanity. Inspired from above, here's an important bit, by the universal soul, that's an alchemical concept, the world soul, the UN enables human beings to reach out through its many service agencies. So if I were to summarize that, despite the conflict of World War II, a greater good came out of that with the United Nations, and they're going to solve the problems of humanity by getting to the root of conflict and problems, which of course is not the Catholic understanding of sin. It's, pretty much the antithesis of that. And that's their peace plan, as opposed to, what you wrote about in the book, the Fatima peace plan, right? And so this is very problematic when you have, statements from people like Pope Francis saying it's the duty to obey the United Nations and international institutions and to demonize populism, xenophobia, and, reminding everybody of World War II. And this is tied to rigid dogmatic Catholicism. And I've actually witnessed this rhetoric myself dealing with problematic RCIAs for my fiance, where when you start to talk about heresy or any distinguishing borders, then you're called basically a Nazi, or they say that dogma leads to things like the Nazis, which is absurd if you understand that Hitler and the Nazis hated the Jesuits just as much as Blavatsky hates them. So I think that might help summarize the concern here, where Theosophy is talking about the great sacrifice of Lucifer, and the Lucis Trust is kind of like maybe a spiritual rock of the United Nations, whereas the physical rock is the Rockefeller Foundation or the Rockefeller family in general, where they built the foundation in New York City, or allowed the real estate for the UN to get set up. And interestingly enough, if you look at Rockefeller Center, you have Prometheus on display, and then also the figure of Atlas, who's built in direct opposition to St. Patrick's Old World Catholic Cathedral, which represents that 19th century Catholic revival. And so thus, when you build your entire modernist Rockefeller Center in opposition to the old world of Christendom, maybe you're kind of saying something without saying it, if you can see what I'm saying. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know what you wanted to respond with.
Yeah, I mean, Lucis means of the light in Latin. And there's Lucifer, the light bearer. Catholic theology says he was the highest angel, but he wanted to be like God. And he said, I will not serve the hierarchy of God's dominion and his logos. And so he fell. So what you're saying is the Lucis Trust is informing the spirituality of the United Nations, essentially.
Yes, they said that they have this consultative status and they work with them in their meditation projects. I think there's a meditation room that they designed in the UN in New York, I believe. If we do more of an exploration that later on, I can go through all the specifics, but there's a lot more that goes with it, tying into the age of Aquarius and all this kind of stuff.
Age of Aquarius. Wow. Okay.
The 1960s, man.
Okay. So, tell me about, you wanted to go over some basics, disclaimers about the whole series, the war in heaven, manifesting on earth. What do you want to say about that?
Yeah. Well, I'd say one thing, the whole reason I got into this stuff was just because I see these things embedded in the world. And if you read through this stuff, there's some things you can't unsee. We'll put it that way. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for everybody. But I do understand that right now there's a kind of a big occult revival, a Gnostic revival. I mean, you see this all over the place, and Hollywood's pumping out movies with all these Gnostic themes like it's nobody's business. And so this is really influential on the culture in general. And this was for me growing up, going watching the Matrix movies and all that kind of stuff. It's just becoming embedded into your psyche. And the UNESCO was foundational to getting the Nag Hammadi texts put online, freely available for everybody, so you can read all of the Gnostic texts and stuff like that. And what's so interesting about that is that, Saint Irenaeus, he's the one who originally went through all these Gnostic doctrines and talked about how wrong they were. And he was really one of the main sources, as far as I understand, to know what the Gnostics thought, because of his refuting them. And so when they get the Gnostic gospel, so to speak, without that Catholic narrative, then it's easy to promote it everywhere because you don't have somebody explaining the problems with it, right? And that's kind of how I view some of Barwell's works as well. So to give like a little bit of a warning, it's that Catholic priests and saints have delved into this material and warned against it, but I guess people are going to be exposed to this, and if you want to combat them and try to convert them to Catholicism, you kind of have to know what you're talking about. But maybe that's not for everybody, and I sort of maybe inadvertently got thrown in this, without maybe a greater good out of looking into some things and being led different rabbit holes that aren't so good in retrospect. But there's truth in all these different things, but you kind of have to pull yourself back and not get so crazy into it, depending on your situation. So for anybody, I would say, that is looking at this stuff and listening, and they just want to, put their fingers in their ears, that's fine. I don't even have a problem with that. It's not for everybody. And for me, my whole reason for dealing with it now is to convert or help convert any kind of new age or occult people. And it's actually been very successful. I've had probably 5 or 6 people who have said that being able to transmute it and invert it back to Catholicism was a major part of their conversion, or they're coming back to the church, kind of like me, because they were similar. And then I've had, a dozen people reach out about something, bring them at least back to a Christianity, even if maybe it's a more Protestant one, or at least going in that direction. So it has been very effective. And that's kind of the only reason I continue to deal with it, is because a lot of people do get caught up in this stuff, and it's everywhere, and I think that that's another one of those things where in the Novus Ordo Church, especially growing up, like, it's a lot of ugly stuff that's so hard for some people that they just want to pretend like the war is over. You know what I mean? And I think that only makes it more ugly. And I think right now, with the Errors of Russia abyss opening up and spreading everywhere, until you confront some of these things, you gotta be honest about it. So this is for the types of people who have already kind of looked into these things and can't unsee some of it. But if people, are suspect about it, or they kind of get weird about it, I just say, don't watch the series. I'm certainly not encouraging that everybody needs to know these things. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, we always recommend it's wise to have caution reading any non-Catholic books, whether that's Protestant or occult. Seek the permission of a priest, or if you're going to be an evangelist, Saint Robert Bellarmine is one who got permission to read all the Protestant works in order to refute them. So this is the reason for this series, is essentially talking about Christ and Christ against the occult. There was actually see if I can find it. I thought of this verse sort of to kick off the whole series, was Ephesians 5:11, which is, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. So that is the goal of this series. So, Mark, you want to take us through some of the groups that you wanted to talk about dealing with all of this?
Sure. And I just add one more scripture I think is really relevant, is wise as serpents, innocent as doves. And I could be thankful that a lot of my reading into these things, just organically, I was able to kind of innocently say, well, something's not right about that. Or where's the actual morality here? They talk a lot about morality. So with that in mind, I guess going back to the 1st century AD, in the different types of battles that were happening then, I think are really relevant to now. And since there's been this sort of Gnostic revival, if you will, these are all the groups that were infiltrating the church and formulating during the times of early Christianity. So nothing new under the sun, perhaps. So I guess to relate it in a more ecumenical way, the God of Israel, the Old Testament creator that the Jews, the Protestants, and the Catholics all believe in, even if they disagree on the Messiah or his church. This is essentially what is vehemently rejected by the Gnostics. The idea that the creator God of the Old Testament, as we understand him to be, or Yahweh, he is basically this horrible, awful tyrant, right? And that kind of sounds like, modern atheistic objections to the Old Testament, right? So, but there's kind of a uniqueness here where, as we'll get into in the next video, where we source back to some of the early Gnostics and Alexandria and stuff like that, they were looking at things. They were like in a kind of a Jewish rebellion against their creator. Their specific conception of the creator was unique to a brand of Gnosticism. And so they were rejecting the Jewish tradition and kind of succumbing to the Greek Hellenistic tradition, but they were very hostile. So hostile that, they started viewing this God of Israel as this disgusting lion-headed serpent beast, or they called him an abortion. And this ties into the Gnostic text on the origin of the world, where it tells you the origin of chaos or confusion. And it's really like the God of Israel is chaos. So when you see Paul dealing with people in the church talking about chaos or God is chaos, and Paul saying God is not chaos, you can start to see that a lot of these early Gnostic ideas were being battled against in the New Testament. And some of the things that might be confusing, if you read the New Testament, just open it up, scripture alone, you don't know any of the history or the Gnosticism, you're like, what is Paul talking about? Or what is this, what are they doing here? Like, and that's where it gets into lingo tied to powers and principalities, archons. There's kind of like a lot of Greek words that are like buzz terms that were popular, like, like logos, right? That was a term that was going around, the Greek conception of like the order of, the cosmos and whatnot. So there's different people that took that concept, were trying to run with it. So like Philo of Alexandria was putting his spin on it, and he was kind of fusing the Jewish and Greek culture in a way that I think is opposed to the Catholic fusion of it with, John the Evangelist and talking about logos at the beginning. And, now you see that today with like E. Michael Jones talking about that, but then there's other people who are talking about it in a different way. So it's like these words that become popular, but how do you define them? What is the interpretation, and what is the authority to appeal to for that interpretation? And that's where everything gets lost. And I think that that's really the name of the game with this Gnostic stuff, is it uses a lot of concepts. Like it will talk about Satan or the adversary. And it will even talk about, apocalypses and revelation and beasts and stuff like that. But you have to understand how they define those beasts. And so really the confusing thing is that this serpent to them with the lion's head is the God of Israel, and he's the beast. And his beast system is what develops into Christendom. So if I were a Gnostic talking about, oh yeah, the book of Revelation is very profound, and I reject the beast system, but they're rejecting Christendom, and that's what's so deceptive about it. It's the same broad terms, but the meaning is completely inverted. So I'll let you get in a word here. If I don't know if you had any response.
Well, so I mean that makes me think of all the Gnostic gospels which are promoted, and you see on the cover of Time magazine or whatever, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Paul, or whatever. That was big a few years ago, and the Da Vinci Code was coming out and all this. So they're certainly inverting and using New Testament language to try to promote their occultism, because they're ascribing these Gnostic texts to the apostles. Can you tell us more about the inversion? So it's not only the God of Israel is inverted. What else gets inverted? Is it just kind of a mirror image, basically?
In a way, I guess I'll try to flesh out some distinctions here that might be useful, because this is how I view it. If the Catholic Church is supposed to be like a Rubik's Cube that is arranged in a particular way, that's saying, okay, on this side of the cube, it's all red, you can't touch that, right? And this side is all yellow, you can't touch that. And maybe here's a side that you can play with, but you can't allow the other sides to change, right? So that's kind of like what's dogmatic, what you can appeal to as like, this is tradition, but not necessarily dogmatic, but it's given a lot of weight. And then where's your sandbox you can play in? Versus, in my opinion, the adversary's tactic is to just rearrange the cube in a bunch of different ways. So all the people rearranging the cube fight with each other because they cling on to what their subjective gnosis has led them to. So they have like a pride attached to that maybe. But they'll always, in that rearranging, will unify on rejecting the Catholic Church's interpretation, right? And so here might be some ways to help show some of these battles, where you have the Pharisees. Actually, no. Let me talk about real quick.
Did you want to put up the image of all that?
No, I'm just using my own notes real quick just
go
to
ahead.
get a visual representation. But yeah, so anyways, so what I would say is that first let's talk about Christ, Jesus Christ as the liberator, let's just say in a broad sense. Obviously the Catholics view Christ as the Messiah, as do the Protestants, and God incarnate and establishing a church, whereas the Jews would reject Christ as the Messiah. But the Gnostics accepted Christ as a quote unquote liberator. But the problem is the way they interpreted Jesus Christ was really entirely subjective and never that he was God incarnate. So this is why it's an interesting relationship, because they will talk a lot about Jesus Christ and how awesome he is. And this is very similar to Freemasonry, but they will reinterpret Jesus Christ to suit their own needs, basically. So during this time, there's a lot of like dualism going around, where, and this is tied to kind of the Jewish revolt against the creator, where the creator is evil. And so if he created creation, then creation is inherently corrupt, right? It is not good. It is fundamentally flawed, and it is basically satanic. And this gets into some weird stuff where creation is tied to women. And so therefore women start to be viewed as a representation of this creator God because women procreate. And then that is intrinsically evil. And this gets into weird stuff with the Cathars later on, and this hardcore dualism of pitting spirit and matter against each other. And
just a quick point. So this is in the popular narrative of the Gnostic Gospels and Da Vinci Code, there was this beautiful esoteric, women priests going on, and women were highly valued, but in fact it's the opposite with the women, right?
And so what happens is, in particular, the Gospel of Thomas. The funny thing about Thomas is you can read through it and you can read stuff and be like, well, that sounds like the New Testament. That's no real problem there. But the difference is when they promote Thomas and those synchronicities there that harmonize, they act like it's this amazing revelation. But I'm just like, these things that are in the New Testament, it doesn't add you any new insight. You know what I mean? It's like, let's take some stuff out of the New Testament that people like. And then they drop the mic at the very end of Thomas, where it talks about how women aren't worthy of life and they need to be changed into men in order to get into the kingdom of heaven. And this is the Rock of Peter, no less, talking to Jesus Christ, saying this and saying that Mary is not worthy of life. Now, I think they're talking about Mary Magdalene, whatever Mary they're talking about in that Gnostic gospel. The point is, male is seen as spirit or intellect, and that is good. And then women are tied to physical nature and creation, and that's bad. And so therefore, bringing women into the masculine mindset is their salvation. And you can see that with modern feminism, right? So they'll invert it and talk about it being a liberation for women, but it's really just a complete mockery of the function of the Virgin Mary and childbirth and what she represents as what women should aspire to, right? Their duties and their own personal sacrifice, where the man's going out and, sacrificing to provide, right? And so it's very clever, but it's really just built upon a complete hostility and demonization of women. And back then there was, there's something to be said about, a patriarchal culture that viewed women very poorly, that you can see carrying over. But now you kind of have a weird inversion where it's like women can do no wrong and men must bow down. So but it's still like, it's almost like the subjective milieu determines like where the dualism is. Now it's like man equals bad, woman equals good. Whereas back then it was the opposite. So this is where it can get confusing. And in my opinion, that might be like Satan's inversion to play with the Rubik's Cube a bit. So you miss the fundamental point that the Catholic ordering of the problems of male and female is the harmonious viewpoint of which people won't fall into those dualisms of masculine intrinsically bad or good, or feminine intrinsically bad or good. That's at least how I look at it.
Yeah, the devil certainly hates men and women working as one flesh. He hates that more than anything. That's the Garden of Eden right there. So whether he blames it all on women or blames it all on men, it doesn't really matter as long as there's conflict.
Exactly. And that's actually another point I would make is there's something inherently subjective about all this. And that's, in my opinion, a very important thing where when people start looking back, like when the French revolutionaries, Condorcet, I think, wrote about the Cathars. The Cathars were dualistic like this, where procreation was inherently evil. And when we get to the Cathar segment, we'll go into some of the nuttiness. But there's modern people who kind of, I say, LARP on what the Cathars represented, but to suit their own needs. So you'll actually have some liberals who are like, the Cathars were really liberal progressives who like tolerance. They were just these peaceful hippie vegans. That's one version. And then you have some Nazi literature. I think a guy in particular, Otto Rahn, who I think actually had a Jewish background, ironically enough. But he was writing about the Cathars had the like Aryan gnosis of like racialism. So which one is it, right? Like it can't be both. You can't have progressive liberalism that's probably more akin to Bolshevism, of which the Nazis were completely against. But then the Nazis are saying that the Cathars had the secret Aryan racialist doctrine. So that, to me, that's my point. The dialectics of pitting those two things against each other, but it's unified on the Cathars were pretty cool. And what were the Cathars doing? Rebelling against the authority of the church in very profane ways, but people reinterpret them to be the good guys based upon whatever they want them to be during the time. And what's the synthesis? Well, they were rejecting the authority of the church. And so you see examples of that all over the place with this kind of stuff.
So would now be a good time to go through just a broad timeline of what we're going to cover here?
Sure. And let's see here. Let me find the... Okay. So I'd say like, the first century, you have the development of a lot of this Gnosticism. And I have some particular academic works that we'll look at so we can get it from, academics themselves. That's where I really try to source everything from. And then corroborate that with the esoteric writers like the Blavatsky or the Albert Pikes or whatever. And then as far as I understand, these ideas were developing with the early Christian church and the apostles. And then they kind of have their own development of doctrine up until around 400-ish AD. And then Gnosticism kind of dies out. And then the church starts having councils and really starts, taking root and defining things and gaining power, just like Christ predicts, right? The kingdom. And so really a centralized location of all of this is Alexandria. There's this kind of what I would call a primitive Masonic lodge that kind of works with maybe like a B'nai B'rith, like a Jewish type masonry, but they're all kind of in harmony with each other. It's just this liberal culture that it is not very friendly to Catholicism. And so you see a lot of different propaganda against people like Cyril of Alexandria and reinventing or just like giving a particular interpretation to the murder of Hypatia and the Great Library, and how after the Great Library was destroyed by fanatical religious zealots, then we went to the Dark Ages and there wasn't a free thinking thought for like 1,000 years until the Renaissance. That's kind of like the Carl Sagan narrative in his Cosmos show. But I call it like this Alexandrian paradise lost to them, that they're always going back to this Alexandrian gnosis. Something about Alexandria is very important with all of this kind of Freemasonic Kabbalah. And then a significant figure becomes Mani or Manes, Manichaean dualism. I'm not sure if I pronounced some of these names correctly or not. People have to bear with me. And this is where a lot of the stuff will source back to as we get into, especially with Barwell's memoirs. He's like a really key figure. And in that, some of the academic work, he's very important. There's also Simon Magus, his version of Gnosticism or his tradition is important too as well. And then when it kind of goes underground, it seems to linger about in these groups called the Mesalians and Paulicians. I don't know a whole lot about them other than that people suspect that the Cathars or the dualism that got transferred from Constantinople and the Bogomils area, somehow they were tapping into these different groups. So I'd ask you, Tim, do you know much about the Mesalians or the Paulicians?
All I know is the Paulicians, I believe, were surfacing around in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire in the 600s. But it was also they're kind of a precursor to the Bogomils, who I think are popping up more in the 800s, if I recall. But there seems to be this bizarre. I mean, these things are hard to trace historically, except for the fact that their ideas are all similar, and they all are secret. So they're all going to the secret party and hanging out and drinking drinks and sharing their ideas. So we assume that they're all kind of working in sort of a, not any sort of formalized conspiracy, but there is a spiritual unity among them. Like you're saying, there's a unity against Christ and the church. But I couldn't tell you much more about the Paulicians.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and the way I interpret it, and this is another thing I forgot to mention, I really love using like Father Ripperger's schema of how demons work and the legalism and what opens you up to demonic influence, and how he said that they could influence your thoughts, insert ideas or suggestions, right? And then you just kind of run with them. And the more you're open to that, the more you might be swayed by these suggestions. And so, in my opinion, the Catholic viewpoint explains all these anomalies of like, where'd this stuff come from? How did this come about? There seems to be an overlap, but there's no real direct evidence. And so if these entities can view all of human history and don't forget things, then they can use whatever influence they can get to try to direct people to stuff. And then you have that continuity. I think that is a very logical explanation, despite the age of reason telling us that it's absurd to view things supernatural like that. I think it makes a lot more sense than the secular, because like if you read through these academics on these things, these are the types of things they're lost on, and they'll write books and books about how did this happen, and then they think, oh, if I get more knowledge about what these different sects were about, maybe we'll figure it out. But maybe the Catholic interpretation is just demonic doctrines that they seize an opportunity. It's pragmatic, and certain heresies work better than others. The fallen angels might be like, well, this Gnosticism really seems to work well, let's bring it back if we can, versus maybe another heresy might not have worked so well, so they don't worry about it. That's kind of how I view these things, and I interpret the history. So with the Bogomils and Byzantium area, we'll talk about this from the Cathars, but like basically there was kind of a mitigated dualism, which is it's like there's not a god of matter, it's bad and evil, that's equal to a god of spirit. Sometimes there's sort of like this monistic viewpoint where there might be a spirit above that duality, and that might lend more towards Blavatsky's Theosophy. Or it's just like a straight up dualism, like spirit and matter, one of the best examples of it. But whichever one it is, they're not going to be, they're going to be against the Catholic Church, right? So whichever way they go with it. And then that comes into Constantinople during the time and starts to spread. And then they form these Cathar churches. They have their own bishops. One particular bishop goes to southern France and starts, fueling the Cathar fire. And like I said, when we get into that part, we can discuss a little bit about the Fourth Crusade's relationship to the Cathar Crusade. And then a lot of that esotericism in Constantinople, will kind of come over in the Renaissance after the fall, or some people like bring that stuff over because they were preserving, as far as I understand, a lot of the texts and writing, whereas the Western side in Rome was relying more on oral tradition. I think that this really gets back to what you talk about in your book, where the oral tradition is very important because you have like a duty. It's like an honor to maintain that. And then with the books, a lot of that stuff can kind of lost. And then the interpretation of it also, I think, gets lost with all of that, gnosis flying around. So I think you see different incarnations of that. And then, of course, once the modern world and the printing press comes, that's kind of like, after a couple millenniums of Christendom, various millenniums, Catholic France or the Holy Roman Empire or Byzantium, then, Satan perhaps is unbound for a time and running amok with all that. Honestly, it's like all the benefits you're given by your creator of Western civilization. It's like the Enlightenment took that and ran with it all. And it's like, oh, we invented all this science, technology, right?
Yeah, right.
It's like a big
farce, is the Renaissance, is that when Kabbalah starts to really become more influential among Christians?
Yes, for sure. I'd say that during the time of the Cathars,
just for reference, this is like 1100s is the Cathars.
Yeah, the 1200s, the early 1200s, that's when they started getting cracked down upon. I think the Cathar Crusade was like around 12.
Yeah, I think it was like 1205 or 1210 or something.
Yeah. Anyway, so that really makes them go underground. And then the Jewish community start getting some of the esoteric Kabbalah there as well. And then there's a great book we'll talk about. It's really awesome. It's called The Age of Secrecy by Daniel Yuta. It's an academic work about all of this espionage tied to alchemy, secrets of the state, like the deep state really got formulated during this time. And basically mystical Kabbalah being fused with that. And this was a harmony point of Jews and Christians, which can really go back to like that Alexandrian community we talked about earlier of like what I call Freemasonry and Kabbalah, in my opinion, is really like Satan's alternative Catholicism or universal religion, where the Catholic Church was fusing the Greek and Jewish cultures in a particular ordering. And that's what a lot of the Jews didn't accept, right? They still wanted to be at enmity with the Gentiles, especially the Pharisees, right? Where the Sadducees were kind of more mixing in and more secular, though. And then the mystical side, the Kabbalah, is like, in my opinion, kind of the satanic response to Christ's kingdom at hand, where now they're inverting what Christ is, and they're taking Christ and making him equal with pagan gods. Oh, he's like the dying and rising Osiris. It's just all the same, man. There's a solar god and he dies and rises. There's a virgin goddess. She births the savior. It's like, you don't need to interpret them differently. They're all one. And that's kind of like the Masonic watering down of all religions. And so, like you said, I think that the Renaissance is where that spark of that kind of gets loosed into Christendom, but the Counter-Reformation dealt with that, in my opinion, in the most proper way it could. And then the good parts about all of that, the Renaissance, going back to these different, Neoplatonic writers or pagan philosophers, they really have a real Renaissance, and there was also kind of a fake Renaissance, right? So it's kind of like, the wheat and the tares parable. They grow together in the church, and at some point they get separated out. And I think you see different little incarnations of that, where they were growing together during the Renaissance, and then they got separated out with the Counter-Reformation dealing with the Protestants' reaction. So the ironic thing is the Counter-Reformation actually reformed some of the gripes, and the Protestants went off into a different trajectory, and that leads up to the Enlightenment, where, again, Barwell's memoirs is really revealing where the Protestants start to kind of become proxy warriors when they don't evolve in the Masonry, and so they become useful tools of a lot of these Masons who are developing out of that line of thinking and getting into all of this esoteric Freemasonry. And then they want to become the new oligarchy, and their stuff just flourishes in a lot of the Protestant nations, whereas in the Catholic ones it's much more difficult. And the Jesuits are the worst, their worst enemy. That's their biggest bulwark against that stuff spreading. That's why after they got expelled, that's when France really started going downhill with that stuff.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and we'll get into that. So we've got the Freemasons, we've got the French Revolution of 1789. So then all these Freemasonic revolutions are happening in the 19th century. You already mentioned Theosophy is coming out as well during that time. You got Aleister Crowley starting his Thelema religion, 1908 or so. What else through the modern period? Because I know you have some images you want to show us, and we do want to get questions too. any other points that we're going to touch on in the past 200 years.
Sure. Yeah. So the interesting thing is you have this kind of diversion. Maybe you can relate it to the Sadducees and then kind of like the mystical Gnostic types, where there's kind of like a secular version or trajectory, and then one that ties into mysticism and magic. And so one of them is saying that there's an impersonal cosmos. There's no miracles. There's no supernatural entities. Any demons is just like fragments of your psyche. And it's like kind of, I don't know, modern psychology, basically. That's one trajectory. And then there's another one that will indulge in invoking entities and connecting with spirits and stuff like that. That may be more the John Dee madness and the Aleister Crowley stuff. And then there's some people that seem to maybe dabble in both, and that gets really confusing. But leading up to this time, it is interesting that the secular side, even though they don't believe in supernatural stuff or, superstitious ritual things, they'll often side with it because it's against the Catholic Church. So to give an example, with Voltaire, when you see his letters to all of his conspirers, Frederick the Great, D'Alembert, etc., they're invoking Julian the Apostate as like their inspiration. They're talking about how awesome he was, and when we're going to do what Julian the Apostate will, basically. And so Julian the Apostate was into all kinds of weird Neoplatonic magic, as far as I understand, and initiating himself into some of these sort of cults. And so they're kind of like atheistic and think that all that stuff's superstitious. So why are they heroes, right? They're united on their hatred of the Catholic Church. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they'll have their own alliance, and you kind of see it now with like the witches who all came out to hex the Trump presidency, right? That you could probably have like the Neil deGrasse Tyson say like, oh, maybe there's a scientifically valid theory for this. Like they don't mind like completely reneging on everything that they've said about superstitious magic if they're fighting who they don't like, right? And that's kind of my point. So Blavatsky's Theosophy, as that develops, she doesn't like the Royal Society kind of secular Darwinism and Western materialism that's leading to. So she wants to bring about like this kind of like Eastern religion or Hinduism that goes with it. And so she'll tie Darwin, which she would believe in, and she'd quote people like Ernst Haeckel many times in her works as legitimate scientific sources. And then she's weaving in her Hindu spirituality tied to like reincarnation and these dialectics of these different cycles of humanity, and then we're evolving constantly towards this higher spirituality. It's basically kind of what we read in the beginning with the Lucius Trust stuff, right? That's Theosophy. And so you have this kind of mystical evolution tied in, and then this gets a hold of Europe and America. And you see it with some of the Nazis. I don't think the Nazis were like super occultist. There's fringe groups that get into that stuff. They're more just like rationalist Enlightenment people, I think. But they all work together. There's always going to be the fringe guy, the Heinrich Himmler or whatever, but that's not the majority of them. But they still are kind of foundational, these things. And so the difference between Blavatsky's Theosophy and like any of these people who might have got into Nazi esotericism is literally just the racialism and anti-Semitism. That's the only difference. You could strip out that part of like when you read some of these Nazis occultists, The Occult Roots of Nazism by Nicholas Goodrick Clark is a good book on that. You could just be like reading something from a New Ager who just wants to, I'm just going to be a chill hippie, but they insert the racialist anti-Semitism into that mix. So if you strip that out, it's kind of the same sort of thing. And so this is kind of like a dialectic, I think, of like the right wing of Darwinism with Central Europe and nationalism and some of the more overt racism versus maybe, I guess, the Anglosphere liberalism that's built upon Darwinism, but they do it in the more passive oppression, right? Where, we're all tolerant, we're all one, we all got to mix together, but it's still Darwin, right? And so I think that Darwinism kind of evolved out of a lot of this stuff that really, in my opinion, has some roots in that primitive Gnosticism, where it's like dialectics and conflict drive humanity, and you drive that conflict to evolve according to the needs of the adepts or elites at the time. And we're kind of living through that right now, a horrible culmination of it.
Yeah. If you want to bring up the slides to talk about some of the images, we're going to take some questions in about 15 minutes. So if you all want to share any questions, we can discuss that. And this is just the introduction. This might be 5 parts total. I don't know if we talked about a 4-part series, then Michael wanted to do this introduction to try to introduce it first. So we've got this show, and we'll be getting to more and more detail. And Michael's also going to share all his sources for a lot of this information. So let's see. If you want to share your screen, I'll put it up.
Sure. Yeah, and then obviously if people get sick, they don't want to hear it anymore, we don't have to do the shows. But for now, here's what we got. So I'm just going to share some image examples to try to demonstrate some of this stuff and show how it transcends all these different viewpoints. So you can have the secular state showing imagery that is occult and tied to how they would interpret these things. And then you can see it with like the more esoteric factions with something like, you know, people who are into like new agey tarot kind of stuff or whatever. So share it here. And is the screen full now for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So here is a depiction of the Gnostic Demiurge. This is the god of Israel, according to the Gnostics. So this is the god we believe in, Tim, according to them. He is a lion-headed serpent beast who is, well, there's certain buzz terms that are attached to this so-called Demiurge abomination. In alchemy, people probably heard about, you know, alchemy turning lead into gold, right? And the kind of the exoteric understanding where you're trying to actually get physical gold. And I'm not denying that people probably tried to do that in the Middle Ages, but there's also this understanding of spiritual alchemy where you're transmuting mindsets or the spirit of somebody. And so what you're trying to get rid of in somebody's consciousness is the lead in alchemy. This would be the dead weight. This is associated with the planet Saturn, which is seen as darkness and ignorance. And so thus, the Catholic Church to them is darkness and ignorance because it worships a creator God of Israel who they say makes false claims. So essentially, this is everything that Satan does projected onto the creator. That's really the fundamental thing here. He's the God of Israel, supposedly, in this system, is the liar and the deceiver and a patriarchal tyrant. He has false laws of the 10 Commandments, which are impossible to obey and are just an illusion, a mirage. And any kingdom that bases their dogma on these commandments is a false kingdom that you don't have to obey those laws. It's a false authority to them. So this is perhaps why you see Paul, especially in the Corinthian church, dealing with a lot of lawlessness, a lot of people who aren't obeying the commandments, and talking about a chaotic God. And then Paul's trying to set them straight. And so we'll talk a little bit about this in the next segment, where Paul, this is what I find so inspiring about him, is that he isn't afraid to use the language of these opponents to the God of Israel and redefine it. And so I think this is like, you know, God creating good out of evil, right? These terms, these words that aren't evil in and of themselves, right? You can use the word ignorant to describe something, but when you reinterpret what that's describing, obviously that's going to shape mindsets, transmute mindsets. So this is tied to a God who's tribal and exclusive, right? He's not inclusive like the UN agenda is inclusive, right? And these are all the typical buzzwords that you'd kind of find coming out of the Enlightenment to describe the so-called Dark Ages of Christendom, right? And so if we were to give definitions here of a Gnostic who's looking at Paul and saying that, hey, I think Paul is a Gnostic. This is a thing. All the Gnostics love Paul because he's using their buzz terms, but they don't understand that he's defining them in a completely opposite way. And so when Paul is talking about powers and principalities, according to the Gnostics or people following their traditions, well, these principalities in the air would be the obedient angels to God the Father. right? And Christ. These would be the saints, the communion of saints. This would be our Blessed Mother in her exalted state. And then the chief archon, being God the Father or Yahweh, he's the big baddie. Well, his false system or his matrix is really the Holy Roman Empire or Christendom. And the social kingship of Christ essentially is this kingdom. But again, according to them, this would be the beast kingdom. So you can see a strange parallel with some Protestants who will reject the Catholic Church and Christendom and the social kingship as having a similar consciousness with all these Gnostics, even though a lot of the Protestants will think the Gnostics are horrible and evil. And so this is where you get a lot of weird conflation, where Protestants will kind of promote Gnostic heresies, but at the same time attack Gnostics. And I see this pattern a lot in what I call the alternative media community, where they'll talk about how Freemasonry is bad and controls the world and all this stuff, but they still promote Enlightenment principles. So you're just caught in what I call the Ouroboros serpent that devours itself. You're trying to cast out Satan using satanic doctrines, to use Christ's words, right? And then the last thing I would say, the archons that are holding up this so-called false kingdom are kings and priests of Christendom. So hopefully that gives a good visual representation of what these Gnostics depict our religion and our faith and our kingdom to be, and why that is so problematic. And you can't just shake hands with the Gnostics and talk it out over some dialogue, if you can see what I'm saying. But all this Gnostic stuff is infiltrating the church. And like I've said, I've witnessed it firsthand and kind of gotten kicked out of an RCIA program because of it. So I'll leave it at that. So before I move on, do you want to mention anything on that?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So here is how we could use icons and Catholic art to show the enmity between what I would call the satanic inversion of that, where tarot cards are kind of like Satan's icons or art. And again, if people are freaked out looking at this stuff, I'm just going to explain what it means. They're just images on a card. And so we have Mary, our Blessed Mother, on the left. And obviously we know the motif of her crushing the serpent, the prophecies in Genesis 3:15, and how that's Christ through Mary, obviously with a first century incarnation, the kingdom of at hand. And then you could relate this, I think, in a lot of very parallel ways to the prophecies of Fatima. So we have Our Lady, and she's crushing a serpent or some sort of, beast kingdom. So you could say for the first century apocalypse, it's crushing pagan Rome, but then bringing good out of that beast and making it Holy Rome, right? So what would Satan try to do? He'd try to take Holy Rome and just turn it back into pagan Rome. It's actually really not that complicated, and that's really what the Enlightenment did. And so if you take it to the occult virgin, where this so-called innocent virgin goddess taming this lion, this would be like the Gnostic Sophia. This is in Theosophy. If you read Madame Blavatsky, she will tie these three things as being synonymous. Sophia of Gnosticism, the spirit of Lucifer, and the celestial virgin. So the virgin of the cosmos, the logos of the cosmos, that virgin in the occult system is essentially Lucifer. And so if you have enmity with Our Lady between the serpent, his seed, and hers, and you have this sort of, maybe you could say, kind of replacement theology where Lucifer fell from grace and Our Lady is full of grace. And this ties into like Father Ripperger talking about some Catholic teachings on Mary and the battle here that I find so profound in all of this, because it really explains a lot of this symbolism here and this enmity, in my opinion. So this would be a representation of the occult Lucifer taming the beast system of Christendom that we mentioned would be the Gnostics beast, right? The lion-headed serpent of the Gnostics. And so what did the Enlightenment do? It tamed the crusading spirit of Christendom with materialism. And now that's kind of what we complain about today in the church, is a lack of a crusading spirit and being so tied into the, the new Roman system of America and all of the material benefits that it brings. So before I move on, I don't know if there's anything you want to elaborate on with that.
No, sure. I keep on going, of course.
Okay. So that's really a simple way of looking at all these complex things. So, obviously Holy Rome, we have that synonymous with Christmas, whereas Beast Rome, you have the Saturnalia festivals. And this is often where the Protestants might conflate these things and be like, oh, this is just the pagan Roman church, and, Christmas is secretly Saturnalia, right? That this is where the conflations happen. And you get this kind of weird, I would say, Gnostic viewpoint in that all governmental systems are inherently corrupt. You can never actually have a government that is a good at all, right? And so obviously Western civilization, based upon the social kingship of Christ and the Catholic viewpoint, that is a greater good. Yes, there's problems, but this is my analogy. I say that Christ's kingdom is like controlled chaos. Man's sinful nature is controlled so it doesn't spill out into this crazy open borders chaos, where the Protestant Reformation, in my opinion, spilled out into open borders chaos, because immediately after, the reformers had their own revolts, and then they're putting those down. And then you see that with the American Revolution, that has its own revolts. And all of a sudden, Whiskey Rebellion or Shays Rebellion, the taxation without representation excuse doesn't fly anymore. So the point is that there's two versions of Rome. There's a city of man, right? And then there's a city of God, going back to Augustine. And so Our Lady, or Christ through Our Lady, either the Mother Church, the typology of Mary, what she represents, baptism into the church, that on the microcosm, you're crushing your own passions, your own vices to conform to the law. And if she's the new ark, the law was contained in the Ark of the Covenant, and she's birthing the lawgiver. And so we have our battle against Satan reflected in the microcosm, combating sin and using the church and the sacraments as the means or vehicle to do that, right? To have unity with the presence of God. And then you could take it to a grander scale of the Holy Roman Empire and spreading the universal kingdom and crushing the sin of the pagan nations and converting. So you can see there's a lot of different things that could be built into these images. And this is what the occult system does. It really plays on typology very heavily. And typology is important, but you have to have an interpretation to go with it. So before I move on, I just want to make sure all that was clear.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So if we bring in the other card here to relate, like we said, we have the Lucifer so-called virgin, the innocent one, right? That the evil creator just, did bad stuff to. He's going to tame what he views as a beast system of Christendom, or the Lion of Judah, right? What Christ is bringing about in his kingship. And so, with all of the Enlightenment symbolism that you're going to see tied to some of these images, you could see esoterically perhaps the satanic spirit who inspires people to create tarot cards, who probably don't really understand what they're doing, because they're just kind of caught up in, what I call the mystical glaze over their eyes. And they're just thinking they're connecting with a higher mind. It's like kind of like people do yoga and they get that yoga glaze when they return from their session and they're kind of out of it. That's kind of how I view probably how a lot of this esotericism developed. It's the fallen angels influencing people, and they're really showing their own religion or inversion. And it's kind of like gang signs or spiritual warfare. That's how I view a lot of this stuff, because I don't think that humans are really conscious of a lot of these things. So if we move on to the French Revolution, here is an image taken from the Jacobins. This is from a book that went through a bunch of the propaganda or just the art of the times during the French Revolution. So this is a representation of the goddess Reason and the all-seeing eye of the Jacobins. And she has tamed this beast. And of course, what were the Jacobins and the French revolutionaries doing? They were overthrowing Christendom, right? And they were calling the Bourbon kings beasts, and it's always depicting the Christian kings as ogres or beast-like and ignorant, right? And that's that Gnostic buzz term, ignorance. And so that was an Enlightenment buzz term. So you can see the overlap here. We have this so-called virgin goddess who is taming this beast through the Enlightenment. So hopefully you can see the overlap here of the secularism and what our world is built upon with the Masonic state, but also the occult world that people might be tapping into spirits and stuff using these cards. It's all the same spirit, just one's going to more of a a more mystic side and one's going to a more secular side, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. And also the other thing I mentioned is you can see the little lion's tail at the top right of the strength card. That's the glyph of Leo, the lion. And so in the occultism, there's this connection with the lion and the serpent, right? Like that depiction of Eyal the Beot, where he's a lion's head and has a serpent's body or tail. And this is kind of connected where, the lion's tail is serpentine. And so it's kind of reflecting the same thing in just one symbol, if you will. So I'll bring it over to another inversion here. Instead of Our Lady, we have St. Michael crushing the dragon or the serpent or whatever you want to call him. And interestingly enough, you see this motif in the American Revolution, but instead you have a woman angel with a sword and shield who appears, in my opinion, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it looks like she's crushing Spanish conquistadors and people that look kind of like, maybe like old Israelites or something, right? So what did the American Empire or the colonies, and then once its revolt happened, it was taken out New France and New Spain, right? There was a battle there, especially Spanish Florida. So is this an esoteric conquering of a new Christendom? And instead of St. Michael crushing the dragon of, the satanic beast systems, here we have the Luciferian goddess or woman, as he wants to depict himself, the innocent one, crushing the, ignorance of Christendom and new Christendom, if you will. And then the other thing, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, is that George Washington up top too?
Yeah, so you have the Apotheosis of Washington. So this is the apotheosis of man. So maybe this is kind of like, in my way of viewing it, it could be like an esoteric, bashing of Our Lady with her assumption, right? She's a created being assumed into an exalted state. So here's man, a created being assumed, but he's got kind of like a pantheon of harlot goddesses, if you will, kind of the sin of Solomon, right? Succumbing to all of these pagan deities. And then we have the liberty cap tying back to the Mithraic mysteries and all this like Roman imagery, right? So they're kind of trying to bring back, in my opinion, the Roman republics before, Christianity ruined everything with its dark ages, right? From the viewpoint of the Enlightenment. And the last thing I'd mention here, just kind of funny little symbolism. You see this kind of nobleman or conquistador type. He's got a scepter with a globe and a hand on top. Now the hand is open. And oftentimes you see the French kings with, the globe representing the dominion, the temporal authority of Christ's kingdom, and then the hand with the two fingers up and below for, the Vatican keys binding and loosing, right? So it's kind of like the spiritual realm and the temporal realm unified under Christendom. And so you wonder if, if you throw that motif of the Christian kings being kind of stomped on by this inversion of Michael, maybe they're saying something else there too. So you kind of get little hints. And it's interesting, the artist who painted this, he was tied to painting some Vatican art. And I think he was just a really good artist. And I don't know who suggested he do this or whatever, but he came over. It was an Italian artist. So this is like a Roman artist coming to a new Rome. But now it's bringing it to a pagan Rome. And like I said, I think a lot of the artistic people are interested in occultism because it's much more visual. But sometimes people who are more right-brain minded, they don't understand the interpretation, the logic that goes with them. And that's the deception for more of the right brain type of people. And then the scientism minded people will get into the Neil deGrasse Tysons and whatever. And they don't want to have anything to do with the idea of supernatural realities and stuff like that. So that's kind of another dialectic of different types of people, I would say. Maybe like the Roman culture and then the Greek culture. The Greek culture was more abstract thinking and philosophy. The Romans were more about what you could do in government and reality. And you're kind of fusing those two sides of human intellect and brain activity, I suppose.
Okay. So we got about 10 more minutes. There's a few questions. Do you want to go through any more of these images before we do questions?
Let me just run through the rest of them real quick. I'll just say it real quickly. Here's one in the UN roundtable room. And the one on the right, this is the centerpiece of the mural. And the guy who made this piece said that this is a phoenix rising. And so, as we mentioned, out of the ashes of World War II arose the United Nations. And that's really out of the ashes of Christendom. That was kind of like the final kibosh, right? Where the Nazis overthrew any semblance of the Habsburgs' rule. And then we have the crushing of that serpent of Christendom, you see with the sword through this kind of lion-headed serpent right in the UN mural room. And then you can see in the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the French Revolution here, we have the goddess of reason unchained. And then on the left side, you see the Young Turks Revolution with their so-called liberty goddess unchained. And the interesting thing about the Young Turks, I'll just mention it real quick. They went to France to study in the Enlightenment. They brought a lot of the Enlightenment back, and they actually implanted the exact French constitution, I think, because constitutions were trending back then. And since the Ottomans were seen as kind of backwards, they wanted like the Western benefits without the degeneracy, but that didn't really happen. And so a book on that, The Young Turks in Opposition, maybe we can discuss it later. But you can see the same motif. And what happens when you get Enlightenment and constitutions back during these times? Well, you get a genocide of Roman Catholics with the French Revolution, then you get a genocide of Oriental Orthodox with the Armenian genocide. So very enlightening, right? And then the last thing I mentioned here, and you can go to the questions, is that in the French Revolution, Declaration of the Rights of Man, you can see the Ouroboros serpent, however you say that word. And you see a continuity here. And this is what I'd wrap up on because I think it's very central. In ancient time, I have a JSTOR article I'll give you that sources this. That I'm getting this information from. In ancient times, from I guess about 5000 BC, with the Egyptian culture to the Hellenistic classical Greek culture, this serpent motif was often used. You can trace it back to ancient Egypt, I guess. And so it's devouring its own tail, and this is tied to creation stories of the cosmos, and gets into the idea of a cosmic egg. And we can talk maybe later about the Big Bang Theory that's predicated upon a cosmic egg creation, which is very interesting, that maybe there's a secret kind of paganism into the modern science of the Big Bang stuff. But, you know, this is what the early Gnostics were looking at. The Ophites especially were kind of obsessed with the serpent, but this is the serpent of wisdom. This is the good serpent, right? Or it's sometimes conflated with, again, the Gnostic Demiurge, whichever way you want to go with it. And then you see that in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. You see it in Middle Ages and Renaissance alchemy. You see it in modern Freemasonry, and you see it in Theosophy. It's actually the symbol of Theosophy at the bottom right there, where they say there is no religion higher than truth. And so my point is, is the serpent of old just shedding its skin in new regimes and tempting people with the same old tactics, but it's much more in a subjective gnosis that's always rebelling against the God of Israel in whatever form, be it the old or new Israel. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We've got a number of questions. We'll try to get to everybody here. Thomas says, why is Mormonism so Freemasonic? Thoughts on Mormonism?
Honestly, I don't know a whole lot about Mormonism. I know that, like, I think it's Joseph Smith said some Masonic lingo, like before his death, stuff about the widow's son. I think that he had some Freemasonic ties, and maybe that kind of Enlightenment development kind of went into it. I don't know a whole lot about Mormonism specifically, but I would just assume that, you know, all that stuff was just kind of trending during that time. And I think, was Mormonism, did that begin in the 19th century?
Yeah, it's 1829.
Okay.
It was a time of great religious interest, shall we say, among New England. That was the time of the transcendentalists and all that stuff.
Okay, yeah. So there was an occult revival that was going on during that time, but at the same time, you had a Catholic revival, you know, Romanticism and stuff like that, kind of like neo-Gothic, neo-Baroque stuff. So it's probably mixed in with that, but I can't really comment on it much more than that.
Here's a question. Would you agree that the use of Jewish gematria with the occult is in essence trying to replace the effects of the Holy Spirit and destroy the marks of the church and the kingdom of Christ?
With the gematria, in my opinion, you know, there is an element of numbers tied to Hebrew letters or Greek letters, and that's, you know, in my opinion, tied into identifying the beast of Nero, right?
Yeah.
So it's not evil in and of itself, but it can easily be taken to kind of a Kabbalah that is maybe fatalistic or something, where the numbers of this or that make something intrinsically evil or something, right? So if you added up the numbers of somebody's name and it equals 666, somehow they're tainted, with it. So it kind of can deny free will. And this gets into maybe some of the Renaissance occultism that I think led to some of the Darwinism, which is kind of denying free will, right? We're all just a result of our biology. And, so there is a way that some of that occult stuff, that in a broad sense, can be used with free will and restricted, that I think is still part of the ancient Israelite culture that was quote unquote kosher. And then there's the satanic inversion of it that takes it to a whole nother level, that brings it into a form of idolatry, I guess.
Sure. Mike is asking about, do you foresee anything in particular for the U.S. and the world regarding the occult?
I think that right now, in my opinion, I think we're seeing a lot of very strange parallels with the first century AD, where I think America is like a new beast of Rome, and it's but it's tied to like the Fatima prophecies and spreading the errors of Russia, and the kind of like the UN beast is that foundation, and the Theosophy is it's kind of religion in a way, and then maybe there's a parallel where there can be a holy Roman beast or a holy America. And I think that that's really kind of the essence of the Fatima prophecies. If her Immaculate Heart will triumph and there will be a time of peace and, a consecration of Russia, we have a weird connection, I think, with old Rome and the Vatican in Rome specifically. And then the United States government, obviously Biden being a so-called Catholic, weird stuff with China, which in my opinion represents the errors of Russia spreading into what's historically in the old Israel, right, Eastern ways, but now it's been kind of redefined. So I think that there's something weird going on with all that. And I think the Fatima prophecies, I think, are very interesting. And it's kind of put a whole new spin on a lot of these things, especially with the enmity of the woman and the serpent with a lot of this occultism. And I think, like I said, I think it's kind of like gang signs flashing back and forth. So I think with a lot of people who are looking towards spiritual solutions right now, Gnosticism, occultism, and stuff like that, that's going to be their natural inclination to go either towards that or some sort of Protestantism. But if they're kind of dialectics of each other, I think that the Roman Catholic worldview is the proper synthesis of all those things. And really, its history and its spirituality is the answer to all of the problems. And I think that will become more and more apparent. That's how I view. So I'm pushing for a conversion of the United States for traditional Catholicism. And think about the irony of that with the 19th century Waspasonic alliance projecting Rome during that time to be evil and, a beast, right? The tentacles of the Roman octopus and Pope Leo XIII coming at you. It's almost like God uses maybe perhaps the own criteria that nations set as its own judgment. And that's what, Christ says in the new covenant anyways, your same standards will be measured back. And I think you can see that in the microcosm and the macrocosm throughout history.
Excellent. So next week, we will be covering the first period, which is Gnosticism and the New Testament. This is going to be very interesting to see some of these connections with the Gnosticism that's being promoted and how the New Testament is responding to that. So let's offer up an Our Father. So we didn't get to all the questions, but come back next time, ask more questions, or comment on the YouTube video, and we'll try to get to all those. So let's offer up an Our Father for the conversion of all occultists to the faith, conversion of our country, all of your countries that you are from. So let me get up my my icon here. Okay. All right, we'll pray the Pater Noster. Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Pater nostrum quotidianum de nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen.